Her name was Nan Whitlock, 15 years old and orphaned. She scrubbed the floors of the Cargill Gulch boarding house for a cot in the coal shed, and she ate what the guests left on their plates. The camp called her the beggar's girl, and not once did they see her cry. One morning, old Amos Crandall went down in the snow at the assay office steps. 30 men stepped around him. "Let the old beggar freeze," the storekeeper said, loud, in front of all of them. "His kind leaves nothing but a debt." Only Nan knelt. Only Nan dragged him in. She never saw the greasy paper he guarded under his straw tick, the one he patted when the cough doubled him. She never wondered about the heavy black rock by his cot, the one he called just a paperweight, or why, over and over, the old man kept asking her the date. If you believe kindness never goes unnoticed, this story is for you. Before we go on, subscribe and comment the town you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let me take you up the mountain. Cargill Gulch sat high in the Colorado Territory, spring-fed and frozen most of the year. The winter of 1874 came early and stayed long. The creek ran black under a lid of ice. The pines held their snow like old men holding their breath. And down in the cut of the gulch, a few dozen souls dug at the frozen ground and waited for a color that mostly never came. It was a hard place. It made hard people. And the hardest thing in it was the way it treated the ones who had nothing. Nan Whitlock had nothing. She slept on burlap sacks in the coal shed behind Gower's boarding house. The shed had one small window, cracked, stuffed with rag. When the wind came off the peaks, it found every gap in the boards, and she learned to sleep curled tight as a fist, her arms tucked in, her breath warming the little hollow of her own collar. In the morning, her hair would be stiff with cold. She'd break the skin of ice on the water bucket with her knuckle and wash her face in it anyway, because a dirty girl got fewer scraps than a clean one. Her people were gone. Her mother had died of the fever 3 winters back, on a wagon road that led nowhere she could name now. Her father, she did not remember at all. There had been a locket her mother wore, silver, worn thin at the edges, with a curl of pale hair inside. That was all Nan had left of the woman. She kept it against her skin, under her dress, where the cold couldn't reach it, and no one could see it to want it. She worked from dark to dark. She hauled water and split kindling and emptied the slop pails and scrubbed the plank floors on her knees till her hands cracked and bled and healed and cracked again. She served the miners their beans and their fatback and their bitter coffee, and she kept her eyes down, because a girl who looked a man in the face got noticed, and being noticed was never a good thing for a girl like her. She had learned to be invisible. It was the only power she had. She moved along the walls. She spoke when spoken to, and not one word past it. And when the men laughed at her, when they called her the beggar's girl and flicked a cold bean off the plate at her for sport, she gathered it up off the floorboards and ate it, and she did not let her face move. Not a flicker. Harlan Gower owned the boarding house, and the store beside it, and near enough owned the men who owed him. He was a wide, soft-handed man who kept his ledger like scripture. Every soul in Cargill Gulch had a line in that book, and Gower measured a person by the number at the end of it. Nan's line, if she'd had one, would have read nothing. And nothing was exactly what he paid her. A cot in the coal shed. The plates the guests left behind. He told her more than once that she should thank God on her knees for his Christian charity. She thanked him. She had learned to say the words with her face empty. There was one other person in that camp poorer than Nan Whitlock. Just one, at the far edge of the gulch, where the creek bent and the pines came down close. There stood a leaning plank shack that let the smoke out through more holes than the stovepipe. That was where old Amos Crandall lived. Nobody knew how old Amos truly was. 68, he'd say, if you asked, but he'd say it like the number amused him. He had a gray beard gone yellow at the mouth from years of hard coffee and harder weather, and hands like knots of rope, and eyes the color of creek water in shadow. He'd come to the mountains before most of them were born, chasing color the way all of them chased it. And the mountains had used him up. That was the story the camp told. Old Amos, a busted prospector, a played-out pauper, a man who'd wasted a life on rock and had nothing to show for it but a cough and a shack. He bought almost nothing. He begged nothing. He came into Gower's store maybe once a fortnight for a little flour, a little salt, a twist of tobacco he made last a month, and he paid in coin he counted out slow, and then he walked back to his shack alone. He kept to himself. He did not drink with the men. He did not complain. And because he asked for nothing, the camp decided he was worth nothing, and it stepped around him the way you step around a stump you've walked past so many times you've stopped seeing it at all. Nan saw him. Maybe it was because she knew what it was to be a stump nobody sees. She'd pass his shack on her way to fetch water from the good spring up the draw, the one that didn't freeze so hard, and she'd see the thin thread of smoke, or the old man out front splitting a little wood with his slow, careful strokes, resting between each one with a hand pressed to his chest. And she'd nod to him. That was all, a nod. But it was more than the rest of the camp gave him, and he came to nod back. One gray afternoon in the deep of the cold, she was passing with her buckets, and he was sitting on his stump, and he lifted a hand, not to wave, but to stop her. "Girl," he said. His voice was a rasp. "You headed to the spring?" She stopped. "Yes, sir, would you?" he started, and then the cough took him. It bent him near double, a wet tearing thing that went on, and when it finally let go he sat gray-faced and breathing careful. "Would you fill this?" he finished, and held out a dented tin pail with a hand that shook. "My legs ain't right for the climb today." She took the pail. It cost her nothing but a few more minutes and the weight of one more bucket. She filled it at the spring and brought it back and set it inside his door, and inside that shack she saw how he lived. One cot with a straw tick gone flat and gray. One stove. One stool. A row of tools worn to shining. And on the floor by the head of the cot, holding down nothing at all, a heavy dark rock the size of 2 fists, black and dense, catching what little light there was with a dull metal sheen along one broken face. "Thank you kindly," Amos said. He was watching her look at the rock. "Just a paperweight," he said, and something in the way he said it was too light, too quick. "Keeps my papers from wandering off." She didn't know what papers a man like that would have. She didn't ask. Asking questions was not a thing she did. She only nodded and went back out into the cold, and she thought no more about the rock than she thought about the pines. But she began to stop at the shack. Not every day. But when her chores let her, she'd carry his water, or split him a little wood, or bring him a heel of bread she'd saved back from the scrap plate, folded in her apron. And Amos, who asked the camp for nothing, learned to expect her the way you learn to expect the one warm hour of a winter afternoon. He'd talk to her a little when the cough allowed. He'd tell her about the country the way it was before the camp, when the elk came down the draw in the fall in numbers that shook the ground. He never once asked her about herself. Maybe he knew there was nothing she wanted to say. But he saved the sweeter end of his tobacco talk for her, and once he gave her a boiled sugar candy, hard as the black rock, that he must have carried in his pocket for a year, and she sucked it slow for 2 days and told no one she had it. That was the shape of things when the trouble came. The cough got worse. She could hear it now from the path, before she reached the door, a deep drowning sound that frightened her, though she couldn't have said why. He was thinner. He slept more, and when he was awake his eyes had a shine to them that wasn't right. One morning she found him unable to rise from the cot, and she knew, with the flat certain knowledge of a girl who had watched her own mother go, that this was the fever. She went to Gower's store, and she stood in front of the storekeeper with her eyes down and her hands folded, and she asked, in the smallest voice she owned, whether Mr. Crandall might have a little credit. 4 bits, she said, for flour and a little coffee and some of the fever powders in the blue paper. He was sick, she said. He couldn't come himself. Gower didn't even open the ledger. Amos Crandall, he said, hasn't got 4 bits worth of anything in this world, and never will. I'm not extending my goods to a dying tramp so a beggar's girl can play nursemaid. If the Lord's calling him home, girl, that's between him and the Lord. It's not coming out of my store. She went to Doc Pruitt next. Doc was a decent enough man when the fee was good, but the fee here was $3 and a 2-mile walk through snow to a patient who plainly could not pay it, and Doc had a warm stove and a bottle and no wish to leave either. He told her to keep the old man warm and give him what water he'd take, and that nature would settle it one way or the other, and that he was sorry, and he shut the door. So, it was Nan. She had watched her mother nurse the sick before the fever took her too. She knew a few things. She knew to keep him warm and keep the water going into him even when he didn't want it. She had no powders and no coffee and no flour, but what she could steal in pinches from Gower's kitchen without being caught. She gathered snow in the tin pail and melted it on his little stove, and she heated stones in the coals and wrapped them in rag and packed them around him to break the chill. When the cough seized him, she lifted his shoulders off the flat tick so he could get the air. And she felt how light he'd become, how the strength had run out of him like water out of a cracked jug. And through the worst of the fever, he talked. Half of it made no sense, names of men she'd never heard. Places, a woman's name, once, spoken so soft and so tender, it made her look away. But one thing he asked. Over and over, surfacing out of the delirium with his creek water eyes suddenly sharp and gripping her wrist with a strength that startled her. What's the date, girl? What's the date today? The first time, she told him. It's the 10th of March, sir, near about. He fell back, muttering, counting something under his breath, his lips moving. And a while later, up again, the same grip, the same urgency. The date. Tell me the date. She'd tell him again. And again. She thought it was just the fever talking, the way her mother had called for people long dead. She didn't understand that the old man was counting, that somewhere behind those fever-bright eyes a clock was running down, and he was measuring it against days he could no longer hold in his head. She only knew that it seemed to matter to him more than food or water or breath, and so each time he asked, she answered gentle and sure, and the certainty of the answer seemed to ease him more than anything else she could do. Under the straw tick, when she lifted him, she'd sometimes feel it. A stiffness. A folded thickness of paper, greasy from years of being handled, tucked deep where the mattress met the frame. Once his hand went to it in his sleep, patting it, the way a man pats a thing to be sure it's still there, and then he settled. She thought it might be money. She hoped, for his sake, that it was, though she'd sooner have died than take a cent of it. She never looked. It was his. That was enough. The camp knew she was up there. Word travels in a place that small. They knew the beggar's girl was wasting her nights nursing the beggar of the gulch, and they thought it a fine joke, the two of them, the two nothings keeping each other company at the edge of the world. Gower knew too. And Gower did not like his kitchen girl vanishing up the draw when there were floors to scrub, nor did he like the pinches gone missing from his stores, though he couldn't prove it. Then came the day at the assay steps, and the camp showed its whole face at once. Amos had rallied. That was the cruel thing about the fever. It let him up for a day, let him feel almost like a man again, and he took it into his head to walk to the assay office. Nan didn't know why. He wouldn't say. He put on his ragged coat and his broken boots, and he went out into the cold on legs that hadn't held him in a week, and by the time he reached the office steps in the middle of the camp, with the men standing around in the trampled snow between the store and the works, his strength gave out all at once, and he went down. He fell face first into the snow at the foot of the steps. And he did not get up. Nan was across the way, coming from the spring with her water pail, and she saw it, the old dark shape crumpling down and the men standing around it. A dozen of them. Then more, drifting over to look. 20, 30, miners on their way to the works, men off shift. Gower himself come out onto his own store porch to watch. And not one of them moved to lift him. They stood in a loose ring and looked down at the old man face down in the snow, and the steam of his breath went up thin and slowing, and somebody laughed, and somebody said something she couldn't hear, and still no hand came down to help him. He was a stump. You don't help a stump up out of the snow. You walk around it. Then Gower's voice came off the porch, big and easy, pitched for the whole crowd to hear, the voice of a man making a joke he's sure will land. Let the old beggar freeze, he said. His kind leaves nothing but a debt. And the men laughed. Nan dropped her pail. She heard it hit the snow, and she heard the water gush out of it, and she didn't care. She crossed that open ground, with her skirts dragging in the drifts, and she pushed between two miners twice her size, and she went down on her knees in the wet snow beside the old man. She got her hands under his shoulder and heaved. He didn't move. She heaved again, and she got his gray face up out of the snow, and it was blue at the lips, and his eyes were half open and rolled up, and she thought for one black moment he was already gone. Then he coughed, weak but alive. She looked up, once, at the ring of men standing over her. 30 faces. Not one of them met her eye, and she understood something in that moment that she would carry the rest of her life. It was not that they couldn't help, it was that they had decided he was not worth helping. They had done the sum, every one of them, the way Gower did his sums, and the old man had come out to nothing, and so they let him lie. She didn't ask them for help. She'd stopped asking the world for anything a long time ago. She got her shoulder under his arm, and she stood, and the old man came up with her, all his loose weight sagging against her small frame, and her boots skidded in the snow, and she nearly went down with him twice. But she found her feet. She got him turned. And with the whole camp watching in silence now, the laughing done, she walked that old man on her back across the open ground and up the draw toward his shack, one dragging step at a time, and she never once looked back at them, and she never once let them see her face. That was the last straw for Harlan Gower. He came up to the shack that evening, red-faced from the climb, and he stood in the doorway, blocking the last of the light, and he told her she was through. She'd been stealing from his stores, he said, and neglecting her work, and making a spectacle of herself and of him in front of the whole camp over a dying tramp who'd be dead inside the week regardless. He was done feeding a girl who wouldn't earn her keep. The coal shed was no longer hers. Let her nurse her beggar and starve with him, if that was the life she chose. Nan stood by the cot where Amos lay breathing his shallow breaths, and she listened to Gower list out everything he was taking from her. The cot, the shed, the scraps, the one poor foothold she had in the world. And when he was done, she didn't argue. She didn't beg. She'd known, the moment she dropped that pail in the snow, that this was coming, and she'd chosen it already without letting herself say so. "Yes, sir," she said. "I understand." Gower looked at her, and maybe some small thing turned over in even him, because for a second he looked almost uncertain. Then he shook it off and turned, and went back down the draw to his warm rooms and his ledger, and Nan Whitlock, 15 and orphaned, stood in a leaning shack at the edge of the world, with a dying man and no cot and no keep and nothing at all left to lose. She went back that night and got her things. It didn't take long. A change of underthings. A comb with 3 teeth gone. The stub of the boiled sugar candy Amos had given her, saved in a twist of paper, and the locket, warm against her skin where it always was. She carried it all up the draw in a flour sack, and she set it down at the foot of Amos Crandall's cot, and that was her home now. She had given up the little she had for a man who could give her nothing, and she did it without a word, and she did not think of it as a sacrifice. She thought of it as the only thing there was to do. Then the winter closed its hand. The days that followed ran together into one long fight against the cold and the fever and the failing of the old man's body. She kept the little stove going with wood she split herself, out front, her hands blistering inside her mother's old mittens. She melted snow for water. She fed him broth made from bones she begged off the one miner in camp with a soft spot. A Swede named Lindfist, who'd lost a daughter once and couldn't look at Nan without his eyes going wet. She heated her stones and packed them round the old man's chest to loosen the drowning cough, and she lifted his shoulders when it seized him, and she wiped his face, and in the long black hours, when there was nothing else to do, she held his knotted hand in both of hers, so that if he woke, he'd wake to something warm. And still, surfacing out of the fever, again and again, the same question. The date. Girl, what's the date? It's near the end of March, sir, she'd say. Or, it's the 1st of April now, I think. And she'd watch him count it out on his moving lips and sink back easier, and she'd smooth the gray hair off his hot forehead, and wonder what day he was walking toward in his fever, and she'd never once come near the truth of it. Then, the blizzard came. It came down off the peaks in the night with a roar like a train, and by morning the snow was to the window and still falling sideways so thick she couldn't see the pines 20 feet off. It sealed the door. She had to dig it clear from the inside with the fire shovel just to bring in wood, and the cold that came through the gap was a living thing that ate the little stove's heat in a breath. For 3 days it blew. 3 days the world was nothing but white roar, and the shack shuddering on its poles, and the old man's breathing, and the fire she would not let die. And the food ran out. She had been feeding him and starving herself, giving him the broth and taking for her own supper the water it was made from, and a few beans softened in it. By the 2nd day of the blizzard the beans were a handful. By the 3rd they were gone, all but a scattering in the bottom of the sack that she counted like coins. She was so hungry the room swam when she stood. She gave Amos the last real food there was, and she told herself she wasn't hungry, and she chewed pine bark for the ache of it, and she kept the fire going, and she held on. On the 4th day the wind died. The silence after it was enormous. She dug the door clear and stepped out into a world gone white and blinding and perfectly still, the sun a hard cold coin in a scoured sky, and she stood there swaying with hunger and looked at the drifts risen halfway up the shack and understood that they had lived through it. Both of them. Still breathing. But Amos was worse. The blizzard had taken something out of him he didn't have to give. The fever had climbed. He didn't ask the date anymore. He didn't ask anything. He lay with his eyes half shut and his breath rattling deep and slow, and his skin had gone a color she knew, a gray with no blood under it, and when she said his name he didn't turn his head. She had seen this color on her mother's face. She knew what it meant. It meant the night ahead would be the worst one, and it meant that unless something changed, he would not see the other side of it. There were fever powders in Gower's store, quinine and laudanum, to quiet the cough enough to let him rest and breathe. And she had no credit and no coin and no soul in that camp who would give a cent toward keeping old Amos Crandall alive one more night. She had one thing. Her hand went to it under her dress, the way it had 1,000 times for comfort. The silver locket, worn thin, warm from her skin. The curl of her mother's pale hair inside it. The only thing she owned in all the world. The only proof she had ever belonged to anyone. Or anyone to her. Down the mountain, past the camp and along the frozen creek road, there was a way station where a trader kept powders and goods. A man who would deal in silver where Gower dealt only in ledgers. It was 2 miles. In this snow, in her state, in the cold coming on with the falling light, it might as well have been 20. And at the end of it she would trade away the last of her mother for an armful of medicine for a dying stranger who could never know and never repay it. She didn't weigh it. There was nothing to weigh. She banked the fire high as she dared. She tucked the blankets close around the old man's still shape and put her mouth to his ear and told him to hold on, that she was coming back, that he was to keep breathing till she did. She pulled her mother's mittens on over her cracked hands. She wrapped a rag around her face against the cold. And she took the locket off from around her neck for the first time in 3 years, and closed it in her fist, and stepped out into the snow. The light was already going. The cold was the kind that stops being a feeling and becomes a fact, a weight, a hand pressing on the chest. She went down the draw and past the dark shapes of the camp, where warm light leaked yellow from Gower's windows, and no one looked out, and she found the creek road under its blanket of untracked white, and she started down it into the blue coming dark. One small figure alone on a 2-mile road, carrying the last thing she owned in the world, walking away from the fire to buy a man she loved 3 more weeks of breath. She did not know there was anything to gain. She did not know about the seam, or the deed under the tick, or the fortune sleeping in a black rock on the floor. She wasn't walking toward a reward. She had no idea one existed. She was just a girl who would not let an old man die alone. And somewhere behind her in the failing light, in a shack sealed by snow, on a flat gray tick, the old man drew one rattling breath, and then another. And his cracked lips moved, and though there was no one left to hear it, he asked the empty room the only question that still burned in him. What's the date? Because the clock he'd been counting all winter was almost run down. And the answer to that question was worth more than the girl walking through the snow could possibly imagine. The way station sat 2 miles down the creek road, and every one of those miles tried to keep her. The snow came to her knees in the drifts. In the low places it came to her waist. She learned to read the crust with her feet, to test it before she trusted it, to find the wind-scoured ribs of the road where the walking was hard but the snow was thin. When she fell, she got up. She fell more than she could count. Her skirts froze into a bell of ice around her legs, and it knocked against her shins with every step, and she stopped feeling her feet somewhere in the first mile and did not let herself think about that. She kept the locket in her fist inside the mitten. She could feel the shape of it through the wool. The oval of it. The little catch on the side. It was warm because her hand was warm, and it was the only warm thing in the whole white world, and she held it the way you hold the last coal of a fire you mean to build again. The light died all the way. The moon came up over the ridge and turned the snow blue and hard and beautiful, and she hated how beautiful it was, because beauty like that does not care whether you live. She talked to her mother. She did not decide to. It just started coming out of her, low, under the rag on her face. She said, "I'm sorry about the locket." She said, "I think you'd understand." She said, "He's all I've got now, and I'm all he's got. And that has to count for something. It has to." Then the yellow window of the way station came up out of the dark like a struck match, and she nearly went down on her knees in the road at the sight of it. The trader's name was Kettleman, and he opened the door to a girl who looked like something the storm had spit out. Ice in her eyebrows. Lips gone the color of a bruise. He hauled her in by the arm and shut the wind out behind her and stood her in front of his stove, and for a while she could not talk at all, only shake. When she could, she opened her fist on the counter. The locket lay there in the lamplight, silver, worn thin at the edges from 3 years of a girl's thumb rubbing it. She thumbed the catch, and it opened, and there was the curl of pale hair inside, her mother's hair, and Kettleman looked at it, and then looked at her. "I need quinine," she said. "For fever, and laudanum, if you've got it, for a man that can't rest for the coughing. And firewood, as much as this'll buy." She pushed the locket an inch toward him across the wood. "It's real silver. It's all I have." Kettleman was a hard man in a hard trade. But he had a daughter somewhere back east that he wrote to twice a year, and he stood there a long moment with that open locket under his lamp. "Who's the man?" he said. "Amos Crandall. Up at the Gulch. The old prospector." Kettleman nodded slow. "I know him. Bought powder off me, years back." Never bought much. He picked up the locket, and Nan's whole body tightened to watch it go, and he turned it in his fingers, And then he did a thing she did not expect. He set it back down in front of her. He closed the little lid over the curl of hair. "Keep it," he said. "I'll take a note against it. You bring me the coin when you have it. I don't take a dead woman's picture off a live girl's neck." She tried to argue. He would not hear it. He filled a sack with what she'd asked for, and threw in tea and a twist of sugar and a heel of bacon, and he lashed a bundle of split pine to her back with a length of rope. And he pointed her at the door with a lantern in her hand and said, "Go careful. And go now, before your feet warm up and start to hurt. Walk before they hurt." She went back into the cold with the locket around her neck again and the medicine against her heart. The road back was worse, because now she was tired all the way down to the bone. But she had the lantern, and she had the medicine, and she had a debt of kindness to pay a man at a stove, and none of those would let her lie down in the snow. She counted her steps in tens. She counted them in hundreds. Twice she sat down to rest, and both times she made herself stand back up inside a slow count of 20, because she knew that sitting was how the cold got you, that it felt like mercy right up until it killed you. The gulch came up gray in the first paleness before dawn. Gower's windows were dark now. The whole camp slept. She went past it like a ghost and up the draw to the leaning shack, and she put her shoulder to the door. Amos was alive, barely. His breath came in a thin rattle, and his skin was the color of ash, and his eyes, when they cracked open, did not know her. But he was alive. She got the fire roaring with Kettleman's dry pine, and the shack filled with real heat for the first time in 3 days. And she melted snow and steeped the quinine and got it between his lips a spoon at a time, tilting his gray head up in the crook of her arm. She dosed the laudanum careful, the way her mother had taught her, a few drops and no more, and slowly the terrible cough loosened its grip on him and let him sink into the first real sleep he'd had in a week. She did not sleep. She sat by him and fed the fire and watched his chest go up and down. Up, down, each one a small victory she had walked 4 miles in a blizzard to buy. And near sunup, without opening his eyes, he asked it again. "What's the date, girl?" She had stopped wondering why. She just answered. "It's along toward the end of March, Amos, the worst of the winter's behind." Something eased in his face. His hand moved on the tick, found the shape of the folded paper underneath it, patted it once. "Not yet," he murmured. "Not yet. Still time." And he slept. The thaw came slow over the next days, the way it does in that country. The eaves began to drip. The creek found its voice under the ice. And Amos began, against every expectation, to mend, not to health. He was too old and too far gone for that, and Nan knew it from the gray that never quite left his skin. But the fever broke, and the cough gentled, and there came a morning when he opened his eyes and knew her, truly knew her, and said her name. "Nan," he said. "You're still here. Where else would I be?" she said. It was around this time that Gower came up the draw. He stood in the doorway of the shack and would not come in, and he looked at Nan with the particular sourness of a man who has been proven small. "Girl," he said, "the spring trade's picking up. I've had 2 boarders complain there's no one to do for them proper." He worked his jaw. "I'll take you back on. Wages this time. 2 bits a week and your keep in the shed. That's more than you had." Nan wrung out a rag over the basin. She did not stop what she was doing. "No," she said. "No?" Gower's face went red. "You'd turn down honest wages to squat in a dying man's hut? You've got no more sense than a—" "I said no, Mr. Gower." She hung the rag on the line she'd strung by the fire, and she turned and looked at him, and there was nothing in her face he could push against. "I'm needed here. Thank you for the offer." He stared at her. Then he swore and turned and went back down the draw. And that was the last time Harlan Gower ever gave Nan Whitlock an order. From the cot, Amos was watching, and there was something in his eyes she had not seen before. It was pride. And underneath the pride, It was a decision being made. "Nan," he said when Gower was gone, "I need you to fetch me Doc Pruitt. And the preacher, Ames. Tell them Amos Crandall's asking, and tell them to come today, while the sun's up and my head's clear." He saw her hesitate, saw the worry cross her face, and he almost smiled. "I'm not dying this hour, child, but I've got business that's waited too long. And I want it done while I can hold a pen." Doc Pruitt came. Because a man near his end is a different thing than a man with a $3 fever, and because word had gone round camp that the old pauper was mending, and curiosity is a doctor's second trade. The preacher came because Nan asked him plain, and looked him in the eye, and the two of them crowded into the little shack in the warm middle of the afternoon, with the eaves dripping and the fire low, and Amos Crandall pulled himself up against the wall with a strength that surprised them all. "You're my witnesses," he said. "The both of you. I want that understood before I start. You're here to see a man of sound mind do a thing he means to do." Doc glanced at the preacher. "Amos, what's this about?" "It's about that." Amos pointed one crooked finger at the floor. "Reach under this tick, Nan. Down by my hip. Bring out the paper." She did. She knelt and slid her hand under the flat gray tick, and found the greasy folded paper she had touched 100 times without ever once looking, and she drew it out and put it in his hands. He unfolded it slow. It was a claim document, close written in a crabbed hand, stamped and sealed at the corner. He held it up so the two men could see it. "This here is the deed to a claim I recorded 3 winters back at the county seat," Amos said. "I filed it quiet. I named it the Widow's Mite. And I never told a living soul what I found in it, because I've watched what men do to each other over gold, and I'd not have it done to me nor to anyone I—" He stopped. His breath caught. He pressed on. "There's a seam in that claim. High grade. I chased it 100 feet in before my lungs gave out. That black rock on the floor, there, the one I called a paperweight," he nodded at it, "the heavy dark stone with its dull metal sheen, that came out of the face of it. Doc, you've knocked around this country. Pick it up, tell me if I'm a liar." Doc Pruitt bent and hefted the black rock, and his eyebrows went up at the weight of it, and he turned it to the light and saw the sheen, and something changed in his face. "This is ore," he said slowly. "This is rich ore, Amos. Where in God's name, in my claim," Amos said. "Which brings me to the will." He had Nan bring paper and the stub of a pencil, and he wrote it out himself, in that crabbed, slow hand, while the two men watched every letter. He read it aloud as he went, so there'd be no mistake. And when he came to the heart of it, his voice, thin as it was, filled that little shack right up to the rafters. "I, Amos Crandall, being of sound mind and failing body, leave the whole of the widow's mite claim and the seam it holds and every dollar that comes out of it to Nan Whitlock, who nursed me, who fed me from her own hand, who spent the last thing she owned in this world to buy me breath and asked me for nothing. Not a foot of it to the camp that stepped over me, not a cent of it to any blood of mine that never once wrote. To Nan Whitlock, who did not ask. To her alone. Nan had gone very still. "Amos," she said. Her voice came out small. "I never wanted, I know it." He reached out and took her hand, her cracked, scrubbed, chapped hand, and he pressed it flat against the folded deed. "That's the whole reason it's yours. Don't you see, girl? I spent my life looking for one honest soul to give a life's work to before I died. And it turned out to be a 15-year-old that owned nothing but a locket and gave it away for me." His eyes were wet. "You didn't ask. So it's yours. That's how you know it's clean." He signed it. Doc Pruitt signed under him as witness, and Preacher Ames signed under Doc, and the thing was done. Amos leaned back against the wall and let out a long breath, and his eyes drifted to the little window where the afternoon light came through. "What's the date, Nan?" he said softly. "It's near the end of March, Amos, like I told you." And he smiled. It was a real smile, the first she had ever seen on him, and it took years off his ruined face. "Then there's time yet," he said, mostly to himself. "The assessment's not due till July. There's time to see it filed proper. The mountain'll keep you, girl. You hear me? The mountain'll keep you now." He died 3 days later, at the first true melt, with the creek running loud outside the door and Nan holding his hand. He went easy. He went knowing. And whatever he had been carrying all that long winter, he set it down at the end and went out light. She buried him on the slope above the shack, and Preacher Ames said the words, and not one soul from the camp came up the draw to stand with her. But the camp came soon enough. Because a will read aloud does not stay quiet in a mining camp, and by the week's end every man in Cargill Gulch knew that Amos Crandall, the used-up pauper, the beggar they'd let freeze on the assay steps, had died sitting on a fortune, and that he'd left the whole of it, every foot, every dollar, to the beggar's girl, to Nan Whitlock, who did not ask. You never saw a camp turn so fast. Men who'd stepped over the old man in the snow were suddenly full of stories about what a fine fellow he'd been. Gower stood behind his counter looking like he'd swallowed a stone because he could not forget, and neither could anyone else, that he'd denied that man 4 bits of credit and called him a debt in front of 30 witnesses. The whole gulch was one long squirm of men trying to remember whether they'd ever been kind to Amos Crandall, and coming up empty. And then the vultures came. The first was Silas Vane. He rode up the draw on a good horse, a lean man in a town coat, 40-odd, with a clean-shaved jaw and the smooth voice of a man who has moved a great deal of other people's property into his own hands. He was a field agent for Sperry Consolidated Mining Company, and he'd come the moment the news reached him. And he stood in front of the shack where Nan was sorting the old man's few poor things, and he looked her over like she was a fence post in his way. "You're the girl," he said. "The one that thinks she owns the widow's mite." "I don't think it," Nan said. "Amos left it to me. It's written and witnessed." Written. Vane smiled without any warmth at all. "Let me tell you something about the law, child, since I doubt anyone ever has. That claim is unpatented." "You know what that means?" "No, of course you don't. It means it isn't finished property. It's a promise from the government, and the government asks one thing in return: $100 of assessment work every year, recorded at the county seat by the 1st of July. Every year." Miss the date, he snapped his fingers, sharp in the mountain quiet, and the claim lapses. Falls open, and any man may walk up and relocate it as his own. He looked at the shack, at the mine mouth up the slope, and his eyes were greedy and certain. That deadline is 11 days off. There's no work been recorded this year. That old fool was too sick to do it. So the day it lapses, I relocate it for Sperry Consolidated, all lawful, and there's not a court in this territory will seat a gutter orphan over a mining company. You can't read the paper you're holding, girl. You can't file. You can't hold a mountain. He touched his hat, mock polite. "I'll see you on the 1st of July." And he rode off, and left her standing there with the deed in her hand that she could not read, and 11 days on a clock she hadn't known was running. She was still standing there when the second vulture arrived. He came up from Denver on the stage, a soft-handed man in a checked suit, and he walked into the gulch asking loud for the property of his late uncle Amos Crandall. His name was Rufus Crandall, and nobody in that camp had ever heard of him, because in all the years Amos had lived and coughed and starved among them, no letter had ever come from Denver, no word, no kin. But now that the old man was cold and rich, here was blood, waving it like a flag. "There's been some mistake," Rufus said, in Gower's store, loud enough for the camp to hear. "My uncle's estate passes to family. To me. This talk of a servant girl and a scribbled will, it won't stand. Blood is blood. I'll have it set aside." So there it was. On one side, a company man with the law's fine print in his teeth, and a deadline 11 days out. On the other, a nephew with blood and a lawyer's confidence, and in the middle, a 15-year-old orphan who had wanted one thing in all the world, which was for a kind old man to live, and who now stood to lose everything he died to give her, over papers she could not read and rules she'd never been taught. She did not scheme. That was not in her. But she was not without friends, though she'd never once thought to count them. Doc Pruitt was one. He'd witnessed that will with his own hand, and he was not a man to let a thing he'd sworn to be undone by a company agent's sneer. He went to the county seat himself and swore out the matter before the recorder, and he saw to it that the will was entered and the hearing set. All proper, before Vane's deadline could fall. Preacher Ames was another. He stood up in front of the camp on a Sunday and reminded them, in a voice that did not spare a single face, of exactly what they had done to the man now lying on the slope, and exactly what one girl had done that none of them would, and he asked them plainly which side of that they meant to stand on when the matter came to be judged. And there was a third friend, one Nan didn't know she had, and neither did anyone else. But he was coming. The hearing was held at the county seat, in the recorder's office, on the last day of June. The 1st of July, and Vane's deadline, was the next morning. The whole of Cargill Gulch came down out of the mountains to see it, packed the room wall to wall, and spilled out the door into the street. Because there is nothing a camp loves like watching a fortune change hands, unless its watching itself proved wrong. Gower was there in the front row. Vane was there, easy and sure, his relocation stakes already cut and waiting in his saddlebags. Rufus was there in his checked suit with a hired lawyer beside him. And Nan was there in her one clean dress, with a court-appointed guardian at her side because she was too young to stand for herself, and the folded deed in her 2 hands. The recorder was a spare, dry old man named Fenwick, who had seen every kind of greed cross his counter for 20 years, and had lost his taste for all of it. He called the room to order, and he took up the will. And he read it aloud in a flat voice that carried to the street. He read the description of the claim, he read the witnesses, and he came to the heart of it, and the room went dead silent to hear it. To Nan Whitlock, Fenwick read, who did not ask, "I leave the whole of the widow's mite claim, and all it holds. Not a foot to the camp that stepped over me. Not a cent to any blood of mine that never once wrote." To her, alone. In the front row, Harlan Gower went the color of ash. The whole camp had turned to look at him, every last one, because every last one remembered the assay steps, and the 4 bits of credit, and the words his kind leaves nothing but a debt, and here was the debt, and here was who'd paid it. Rufus's lawyer was on his feet fast. A dying man's scribble, extracted by an interested party. The girl nursed him alone, no doubt whispering in his ear the whole while. We say undue influence. We say a servant preyed on a sick old man. We say blood, sit down, said Fenwick, without heat, till I've finished. He laid the folded deed open on the counter, flat, under the lamp. He opened the great recorder's book beside it, to the page where Amos Crandall had entered the widow's mite claim 3 winters back, and he set the 2 side by side for the room to see. The same crabbed hand, the same description of the seam, word for word. The same signature. This deed, Fenwick said, matches the register in my own book, in the dead man's own hand, entered 3 years gone, long before this girl ever nursed him. That's not a deathbed scribble, sir. That's a recorded claim, plain and genuine. He looked at Doc and the preacher. You 2 witnessed the will? We did, said Doc Pruitt, standing. I watched him write every word with my own eyes, sound in his mind if not his body. And I'll add this, since we're on the subject of undue influence. He turned and looked straight at Rufus. That old man never had $2 to rub together the whole time I knew him. If that girl was preying on his fortune, she's the only soul in this territory who managed to do it without knowing there was one. She didn't know. Nobody knew. That was the whole point of how he kept it. A murmur ran through the room. Rufus's lawyer sat down. Then Fenwick took up the last piece, and this was the one that turned the whole tide, and Vane leaned forward to hear it because it touched his prize. "There is the matter of the ore," Fenwick said. "The estate submitted a specimen for assay. I have the assayer's report here, entered into the record." He read it out, slow and clear. "The seam of the widow's mite runs high grade. On the exposed face alone, the claim is valued at not less than $26,000. The number went through the room like a wind through wheat. $26,000. Off a shack with a leaning door, and an old man who'd been denied 4 bits of credit." Gower made a sound like he'd been struck. And Silas Vane, in his good coat, was seen to do a quick and open bit of arithmetic behind his eyes, recalculating in front of everyone exactly how much he stood to take if he could only make that girl's paper fail. He rose. Smooth as ever. "A fine document, I'm sure," Vane said, "and it changes nothing that matters. The claim is unpatented. The assessment work for the year has not been recorded. By statute, the 1st of July, he took out his watch, opened it, closed it, which is tomorrow. The claim lapses for want of that work and falls open to relocation. The dead man's wishes are very touching. But the law does not care about touching. There's been no work filed. And I intend to file my relocation at the opening of business tomorrow." He almost smiled. "The girl can inherit a lapsed claim all she likes. She'll inherit nothing but a hole in the ground that belongs, by law, to Sperry Consolidated." And for a moment it hung there. Because he was right about the law. The work had not been recorded. Amos had been too sick to climb to the county seat, and Nan had spent the whole spring at his bedside and then at his grave, and had never known there was a clock at all. It was into that silence that the third friend stepped forward. He was a big, weathered man in a teamster's coat, come in quiet at the back, and he pushed through the packed room with his hat in his hand. "Recorder," he said. "Name's Bogue. I freight ore out of these mountains, and I knew Amos Crandall better than any man here, though I never spoke of it, because he asked me not to." He turned and looked at the room. "Some of you know me. None of you knew this. 4 years back I was busted flat, wife sick, going to lose my team, and a broken-down old prospector that everybody in this camp called a beggar, he grub-staked me. Out of nothing. Out of the little he had. Told me to pay him back when I could, and never to say a word. So I owed Amos Crandall, and this last spring, when he knew he was too sick to climb up here himself, he sent for me, and he hired me to do his assessment work on the widow's mite, $100 of it. And I did it. Every foot, all lawful." Vane's smile was gone. "I did the work in May," Bogue said. "I've got the account of it, signed and dated, and the sworn statements of the 2 men that labored it with me. It was done. All that was left was the recording, and Amos meant to see to that himself, and then he died. And the girl never knew it needed doing." He walked up and laid the papers on Fenwick's counter, next to the deed and the book. "So here it is. The work's done and proven. It only wants the filing. And there's still," he glanced at Vane's own open watch, "still in the man's hand, the better part of a day left before your July, sir. File it now. Recorder, there's time. And to spare." Fenwick looked over the teamster's papers. He looked at them a long time, checking the dates, the signatures, the sworn marks. And then he took up his pen, and he opened his great book, and in front of the whole packed room and the whole packed street, he entered the assessment work of the widow's mite claim into the record of the county, dated and lawful, with hours yet to spare on the last day of June. He set down the pen. "The work is recorded," Fenwick said. "The claim stands. It does not lapse. There is nothing to relocate." Silas Vane closed his watch. He looked around the room, and the room looked back at him, and there was not one face in it on his side. He did not argue. Men like Vane do not argue when the paper has gone against them. They simply add up the new sum and move on. He picked up his hat. He walked out through the parting crowd and down to his horse, and he took his sharpened relocation stakes out of his saddlebag and dropped them in the mud of the street, because they were no use to him now. and he mounted and rode out of the county seat without one word to anyone. That left Rufus. Fenwick turned to him. "As to the blood claim," the recorder said, "the will's genuine, the deed's genuine, the witnesses are sworn." "That's a strong will, Mr. Crandall. There's only one thing that could set it aside, and that's a showing that the dead man didn't mean it. So I'll ask you one question, and the whole of your case rests on the answer." He leaned forward. "When did you last write to your uncle?" Rufus opened his mouth. He shut it. His lawyer looked at him, and something in the lawyer's face gave up right there. Rufus said. "We weren't. There were reasons. When did you last write him?" Fenwick said again, flat. "A letter. A word." In all the years he lived up that gulch, and starved, and coughed, and was too proud to beg. When? And Rufus Crandall had no answer. Because there was none. He had never written. Not once. And every soul in that room understood, in the silence where his answer should have been, that his absence was its own verdict. A stranger's child had kept the old man alive all winter. His own blood had not spent 3 cents on a stamp. The will did not just stand on the paper. It stood on that silence. "Case for the estate," Fenwick said. "The will's admitted. The girl's title's good." He ceded Nan's claim through her court-appointed guardian that very hour, all lawful, and the widow's mite, and the seam, and the $26,000 sleeping in the rock. And every dollar that would ever come out of that mountain belonged to Nan Whitlock. To her alone. Just as a dying man had written it in a crabbed hand by a low fire, 3 days before the melt took him. No one was jailed. No one gloated. That was not how it went. The arrogant were simply, quietly, publicly undone by paper and by witness, which is a heavier thing than any shouting. Gower could not lift his eyes to her as she passed him going out. Vane was already gone down the road. Rufus signed the quitclaim his own lawyer put in front of him and took the stage back to Denver empty-handed, and no one in Cargill Gulch ever saw him again. Nan walked out of the recorder's office into the last light of a June evening, a 15-year-old girl who owned a mountain, and the only thing she felt was that she wished the old man had lived to see it. Not for the gold, for the sitting together. She'd have traded the whole seam for one more morning of his cough easing and his eyes knowing her and his thin voice asking her the date. A year on, the widow's mite headframe stands on the slope where the leaning shack used to be, tall against the sky, and the stamp mill runs down by the creek, and men draw honest wages there. The black rock, the one Amos called just a paperweight, sits on the windowsill of Nan's own house, catching the morning sun, and she has never once let anyone take it down to the mill. Because it isn't ore to her. It's him. She kept the folded deed. She keeps it in her mother's old locket case, the silver oval she once carried 2 miles through a blizzard to trade, and never had to, because a hard man at a stove couldn't take a dead woman's picture off a live girl's neck. She went back and paid Kettleman his coin the first month the mill ran, and a great deal more besides, and they are friends to this day. Bogue, the teamster, is her partner now, on a partner's wage and a partner's share, because a man who kept faith with Amos in the dark keeps it in the daylight too. She never once had to ask him to. And the others. Harlan Gower buys his flour on Nan Whitlock's credit these days because his store leans on her mill's trade to live, and she has never once refused him it, nor mentioned 4 bits, nor the assay steps, nor a single word he said in front of 30 men. Sperry Consolidated works a lease alongside her on the lower ground, by contract and by rent, paying for what Silas Vane meant to take for nothing. And Nan Whitlock, who was once called the beggar's girl by a whole camp, has never in that year called one living soul a beggar. Because that camp measured 2 people by the coins in their pockets. The used-up old pauper and the orphan who ate off other men's plates. And it turned out those were the only 2 in the whole gulch who were worth anything at all. That's the part I keep coming back to. Kindness given with no thought of return. It looked like the poorest bet in that whole cold country. And it was the only one that ever paid. If a story like this one stayed with you, comment the town you're watching from. I want to see just how far the old man's kindness travels.